hope that perhaps going ahead as Thursday Musings goes down in history, 10% of the musings would be done by me. What more privilege can one want than to be part of this rich and remarkable professional journey? As Gaurang has pointed out, there is a background to the session that we have planned for today. And the background, friends, is in the episode that took place in Sangli recently in Maharashtra that hit the headlines concerning a family of about 9 people who were found in 2 separate locations in Maharashtra. And I was recently in Orissa for a series of programs that SAMVAD was doing. And I'd had a discussion with Amrit. The plan was actually to do something else, but we got to talking about this particular phenomena, and Amrit particularly expressed his concern because this hit the headlines and many people actually spoke about it on television. And we felt that it would be in the fitness of things to be able to do a session on this and share certain perspectives for the mental health fraternity to take cognizance of what this phenomena actually means. Dr. Bansi Suwalka, I see that you have a hand raised. Is there any issue that you're facing, or is that by accident? May I continue? All right, perhaps it is by accident.
He's joining. I think that is some technical issue.
Okay, right. So the whole perspective on this session actually started, friends, with this news item that you see before you. 9 members of a family of 2 brothers were found dead in Maharashtra's Sangli district on Monday, police said, and maintained they suspect it to be a case of suicide pact, while preliminary probe suggests the duo had heavily borrowed money from various people. So ye thi Vartaman kahani. But have a look at these items, friend, in front of you. Ye pehla jo hai, family suicide pact in Mumbai. 6-year-old dies, mother in hospital, father disappears. This is also 2022, in May of this year. एक 17 साल का लड़का और उसकी माशूका allegedly ended their lives on Monday morning in Gurgaon in Uttar Pradesh. ये पुरानी news है. The 2 teenagers had been in a relationship for 3 years and wanted to get married. However, the families of the 2 teens opposed their marriage. In an apparent case of a suicide pact, 3 girls who were close friends of each other were found hanging from a tree in Nabarangpur district. This is Odisha, Amrit and Tufan, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
On Saturday evening, ye bhi purani khabar hai, even as police continue to look for the reason behind the act. Apparently fed up with abject poverty, 3 sisters in Bilaspur district have allegedly committed suicide by consuming poison, police said today. The three siblings, residents of Dakhankampa village in the district, and the daughters of, I blacked it out, were dejected as their father could not find a suitable match for them because of poverty. In 1982, four young girls who worked as weavers went to a toddy shop in Kerala and drank a glass of toddy each. Their purpose was not to get drunk. The purpose was simple. अगर मर्द कर सकते हैं तो हम क्यों नहीं कर सकते? The events that followed were a systematic attempt to ostracize the young girls. After facing a few days of isolation, when the harassment became unbearable, the girls decided to commit suicide. Two of them died. The next day, a leading newspaper mistakenly stated in their report that three girls had died instead of two. The name and photograph of one of the girls who did not commit suicide was also published. The day when the report was published, the third girl committed suicide along with her entire family. This, friends, was the theme actually of a Malayalam film made by K.P. Sasi called Iliyam Mullam, Flowers and Thorns. Shashi often said whether the flower falls on the thorn or the thorn falls on the flower will get damaged. अब इन चार कहानियों पे और ये बॉम्बे की कहानी जो अभी वर्तमान जून में हुई, इस पे आप थोड़ा गौर फरमाएं, pay a little attention to this and look at the kind of themes that play out. Gender is definitely involved here. Economic strife, poverty is definitely involved. Relationships, caste, religion, patriarchy is also involved. And if you actually look at all the themes of the collective suicides that took place, this would be something that kind of plays out. It's a recurrent kind of theme. Now, the reason I'm stating this is we all recognize that among the health parameters, I'm talking about health, not mental health. Among health parameters, particularly where mortality is concerned, from the mental health perspective, suicide is one of the biggest and the most important variables that has been listed in most World Health reports. And it's a public health problem, not necessarily always a clinical problem. You will also remember that till very recently, attempted suicide was punishable by the law. Interestingly, a remnant of the colonial relic of a law where 100 years ago, it would surprise you to know what the legal disposition to attempted suicide was. It was death by hanging. Look at the absurdity of the situation. And in the Maruti Shanbal police constable case that went up to Supreme Court, which considered the IPC section against suicide as ultra-virus of the fundamental rights of people. And initially there was a Supreme Court judgment, and then there was another bench that repealed that judgment. IPS, as a body and many other NGOs, wrote to the government and wrote to many other agencies to plead that attempted suicide, though it has a clinical context, is not a legal problem. It is a human problem. And it needs to be treated with the kind of humaneness and compassion, because not all people who attempt suicide are necessarily mentally ill. Yes, there is a certain percentage. And if you look at the difference between completed and attempted suicide, and if you look at suicide pacts, which is the subject of today's deliberation, then the issue becomes even more complex and interesting. अब सवाल ये उठता है, why are more Indians signing suicide pacts? तो किसी ने एक्सपर्ट से पूछा. Friends, in 2020 alone, this is just the time that the pandemic hit, India saw at least 15 reported cases of suspected mass suicides. And at that time, mental health practitioners said that Indian authorities are ill-equipped to intervene on time. They were not necessarily talking about the mental health fraternity, but they were talking about civil society and structures of resolving and structures of support that need to exist, particularly when human beings face with day-to-day predicament that pushes them into a situation of desperation and hopelessness, which may escalate into what you could use your clinical frameworks to diagnose as depression. But I think there are very many more serious issues that we need to keep in mind. अब ये कहानी देखिए, किसी कोई लिखता है, last week a family of 5, a couple and 3 children were found dead in their house in a village in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu, and preliminary investigation hints at the possibility of a suicide pact or an agreement among 2 or more people to die by suicide over death-related issues. Now, how can children be involved in a pact? So look at the complexity that comes in here. So obviously, there is the desperation is such that there is a homicide and a suicide complexity and complication that is involved here. But let's step back a bit. कोई कहता है कि किसी दिसंबर में financial distress led to a woman and her 2 daughters into a suicide pact. In yet another case from last month, the couple and their daughter died of a suicide pact, which was really revealed by another daughter who backed out and informed the neighbors. An initial probe states that the father had just gone through heavy loss in the milk business. So, financial, business losses on the one hand, with middle class, upper middle class people, and abject poverty. उत्तर प्रदेश की ही केस है, जनाब आलिम को शायद ये याद होगा that there was a father, desperate, 3 girls, कैसे शादी करूं इनकी, and they got into a desperate situation, and the father was afraid that if he was not there anymore, what about the safety of the girls? And there was a despondency and a hopelessness created in their psyche, leading to a suicide pact and the death of these sisters. So look at the combination of how financial circumstances and its combination with gender and patriarchy makes a difference in the kind of phenomena that we see in civil society. Now, in the western state of Maharashtra, bodies of 3 young men were recovered from a forest after a suspected case of suicide pact in which the youth were allegedly trying to attain nirvana. The cops found several items to make the link to superstition, saying thereafter that suicide pacts have been a recurring pattern over years. In fact, in 2015, experts noted that suicide pacts are on the rise, and in the year 2019, there were 72 cases of mass or family suicides, according to official data. And you all know this 2018 mein, the significant case that mystified Indians, where a family of 11 people in Delhi were found dead under mysterious circumstances. and the police suspected occult practice, while psychologists stated the role of shared psychotic disorder, or what they call as the madness of many, at play. But if you really look at an analysis of these cases of suicide pacts or collective or mass suicides, this whole shared psychotic, uh, the superstition are a minuscule percentage. Most of them seem to be related to relationships, parental objection, which is the couples, to marriage issues and pressure from the extended family, to financial issues, to the whole gender and patriarchy theme that plays out in a situation of hopelessness. तो इसी चीज को लेके our beloved Lakshmi Vijay Kumar, we know that for so many years she has been associated with the helpline Sneha that she founded in Chennai, and her phenomenal national and international work in suicidology, and she's indeed India's face in the whole scene on suicidology. And this was published in a journal called Crisis, where police records were seen in the state of Tamil Nadu, and there were a total of 148 suicide pacts identified involving 324 people. And they found that more women died than might be expected from general population figures. And again, you see social stresses like financial problems and marriage-related issues were the principal causes. And this was something that Lakshmi had published almost 20 years ago. So there has been a concern in the Indian mental health fraternity with this phenomena for quite some time. But if you look at what has been happening from 2020 onwards, I showed you the data in 2020 itself, where 72 cases have been registered. I believe, friends, that this is the time for all of us to take cognizance of this beyond its clinical context of severe mental illness or suicidology that arises from stress, adjustment, relationship problems, that comes to a clinical context, to look at a public mental health approach, to look at how both primary and secondary prevention can actually be attempted. So if we say by definition that there is something like a suicide contagion, हम जब infectious diseases की बात करते हैं, in fact, some of the old workers in suicidology, Schneidman, Kreitman, they have all spoken about this inner city ghetto, poverty-ridden alcoholism, domestic violence, jahan there's almost like a suicide contagion. People have also spoken about it in the context of media reporting and the Werther phenomena, and therefore media guidelines from WHO, from various agencies of responsible media reporting on death by suicides. But if we believe that the exposure to suicide or suicidal behaviors within one's family and one's peer group, forget about media, results in an increase in suicide and suicidal behaviors, this really brings us to one important issue. And I think we need to recognize this in the context of the discussion and debate that we are tabling today, which is the whole idea of the farmers' suicide in remote parts of the country, which have a way of appearing and disappearing from our national media and national consciousness, mainly by cotton farmers in the Maharashtra's Vidarbha region. And this hit an all-time high since June of 2020, almost 710. Now, if you look at the whole country, I'm not saying that one farmer and another farmer made a pact. But if you look at this phenomena from a social consciousness or a collective consciousness perspective, and you look at an expanded responsibility that we need to contemplate as public mental health professionals, core statistics keep piling up. Now, Vidarbha follows a pattern seen in Andhra Pradesh, in Kerala, in Karnataka, and in Punjab. And Mr. Sainath, one of the most respected journalists, has said this is more than an agrarian crisis. In fact, he has slammed those who attribute farmers' suicide to cases of depression rather than to economic factors, and for failing to examine the real cause of this depression. So, friends, suicide pacts are neglected occurrences. I mean, they have features distinguishing them from single suicides, which, in single suicides, you can be seen as residing in the characteristics of a pact relationship. But when you look at dyads, couples, two friends, two people who are in a romantic relationship being objected to by families, by the community, two people intercaste, interreligious, interregional marriage, hounded, vilified, on the run, pursued, victimized. Now these dyadic and then the family. So these are dyadic. Then the family of 5, family of 7, family of 9, family of 11, with the economic theme on the one hand. I'm leaving aside shared psychotic disorder and so on. If you look at the economic factor, and more than that, the gender and patriarchy factor, particularly because the predominance of women involved in the whole pact, and the fact that there is no point in leaving children who cannot be party to this decision, because we cannot leave them to the mercy of the system and the state. So if we have decided to go, it's better that we take them also with us, kind of pathological thinking process. And collective suicides, which are not necessarily in the family, the 3 friends in Orissa, the 3 friends in Kerala, the 3 friends, who were into some superstition, they have several features in common. सबसे पहली बात है exclusivity and isolation. And invariably you will find in most pathological psychiatric conditions, this whole business of somebody kept a person incarcerated for 17 years and nobody knew, till that person escaped, and by that time she'd already had 4 children or 5 children, and maybe that person was psychotic and she was initially kidnapped and so on. All these people live in isolation. They are perceived as odd. The second is the threat of a dissolution of the relationship, whether it is a dyadic romantic relationship or the dissolution of marriage by the pressures that external forces come to bear on them, or the dissolution of a family because of severe financial and economic stresses that the family is facing, but also the presence of a powerful initiator. Initiate कौन करता है? ये बात शुरू कहाँ से होती है? Who sows the seed of hopelessness and of fatalism, which then sets the ball rolling, for an entire family to be drawn in to this inexorable power of this kind of thinking, where, as I often said, that if you really look at the phenomenological dimensions of suicidology, there's a difference between a person who says, I'm in a difficult situation, to a person who says, my difficult situation is intolerable, my difficult situation is unsolvable, I do not wish to live, I wish to die, and I wish to kill myself. They are not the same phenomenologically. And therefore, just as we say that domestic violence is not a private problem, when people say, बाजू वाले घर में होता है, भैया, it's their personal problem, we should not intervene. Domestic violence, friends, is a public health problem. And that's why we have the Bell Bajao campaign. Ring the bell. Person may open the door and say, mind your own business. But at least they know that someone is watching and listening there. Similarly, when you know that someone is in a predicament, and I've said this in my earlier session when I spoke about the intolerance of uncertainty, social cohesion is and when I spoke about grief, social cohesion is the only answer to a first level response to a family in predicament, where you recognize that a certain human being is in a position of despondency and hopelessness. And before that progresses to more intense level of suicidality, how does Beck define hopelessness? Aaron Beck's definition of hopelessness is two. My problem cannot be solved and there is no one to help me. Of course, there is a hopelessness scale, but the principal construct of hopelessness is my problem cannot be solved and there is no one to help me. But the moment you offer that assistance, then you create a situation where the suicidality does not progress to a level that it gets internalized as a strong conviction in the powerful initiator, and then, like a contagion, expands to other family members, and they also get convinced in this notion of despondency and hopelessness. Some final thoughts before we open it out for discussion, friends. For some cases, like I said, it is difficult to establish whether the death was the result of a suicide pact or of a homicide, suicide without the consent of the victim, particularly when the victim are very young children. So an objective element such as a suicide note and motive is required often to prove that a suicide pact is involved, particularly if there's a powerful motivator who is either psychotic or has severe mental health issues, not necessarily psychotic, or is a victim of very strong gendered or patriarchal notions. The others are not that fussed about it, but get persuaded. And, let us not forget, friend, the whole Guyana town Jim Jones episode where 300 people were found dead because of this guy who was basically running a cult community in Guyana town of Jamaica. And there were allegations of abuse and so on, and then people were coming to basically investigate and take charge. The police were involved. There were some complaints. He managed to convince that, and now not all of them were necessarily oriented or agreeable to the whole idea of ultimately his convincing them to. So that's one end of the pathology. Perhaps a one-off case, not that it has not occurred, but as a fraternity, I think what happened in Bombay in May of this year, where the child died, the mother survived, and the father is missing. Difficult to establish, where this is. And what happened in Sangli more recently, just a week or two ago, is clearly an element where a family of 11 is in such economic desperation and in such significant and severe debt that it was difficult for them to. So, in essence, there are lover pacts, there are spouse pacts, there are friend pacts, and there are family pacts. And finally, there is COVID. साइकेट्री रिसर्च में 2020 में ये पेपर छपा, COVID-19 suicidal behavior among couples and suicide pacts, a case study evidence from press reports. There are 6 or 7 reports, of which at least 5 are from India, again spanning the same themes. There are lover themes, there are family poverty themes, there are spouse themes. So I think that if you really look at international literature, particularly even what COVID has done, because we recognize that pandemics of the nature of COVID have a disproportionate impact on the more vulnerable populations, the daily wage workers, the migrant workers. We were very concerned and conscious that this was the time to be aware of child labor, child trafficking, child marriages, and kids being forced into situations due to economic helplessness. Unfortunately, in a gendered and patriarchal society where you're struggling to make 2 ends meet, the marriage of a girl means 1 mouth less to feed. So it's looked like upon as an economic recourse to take, so that there are less mouths to feed in a family that is already struggling. And then she's not able to get along because this is not a marriage of choice, and then either is sent back to her natal home, and then what then does to the whole spiral of despondency and hopelessness, because there's already debt involved there. So this is a theme as we emerge from the pandemic. And the emerging of the pandemic, as we all know, has no defined sharp line. But this is an issue that we need to keep in mind as we go along. So these are some of the issues, friends, that I wanted to bring to your notice. And I would hand you over to Alim and to Amrit to basically cure it. I'm sure many of you have your own ideas that suicidology has always interested me from a human perspective and from the perspective of trauma. I have been deeply involved in actually setting up the helpline, one of the initial helplines called Sahai with the Medico Pastoral Association. I designed the training protocol for them and trained them. I've also had the privilege of having attended Sneha's 10th celebration. And on 22nd of July, I'm going to be doing a session for an NGO which is Delhi-based called Sanjeevni, on how mental health professionals can deal with the whole issue of loss and grief, particularly if it occurs in the context of death through incidents like self-harm. So we have a serious agenda ahead of us. I'm also happy to see that Kiran has joined us. Welcome, Kiran. We have a serious agenda in front of us as from a public mental health perspective. And I would urge all of you to put your heads together to think of all this. And also the IPS section, which works on this area, to come up with further programs and discussions and put in place a robust plan to go ahead with this. I also would like to say, in as part of the conclusion, as Nikita has pointed out very correctly, that this whole business of non-suicidal self-injuries, in fact, my colleague Dr. Rajendra, assistant professor in the Department of Child Psychiatry, NIMHANS, before I retired last year. His entire DM thesis was on cutting behaviors in childcare institutions. It's almost like an epidemic that. So we have actually, Nikita, produced a manual on non-suicidal self-injuries, particularly from a group therapy perspective in children in institutions. So you're absolutely right that non-suicidal self-injury, not merely as Pacts, but almost like an epidemic in childcare institutions, is something that we often keep in mind when we. So if you, I've taken the liberty to put on chat the website of Samvad, which is nimhanschildprotect.in. And if you look at the resources, Rajendra's manual on approaches to non-suicidal self-injury in children who live in groups and institutions, where they look at conflict resolution, self-cutting as a method of tension release or conflict resolution, then becomes like a collective response. They may not necessarily make a pact, but it's a collective response. So again, I said, between a pact which occurs through actual conversation and a joint decision that occurs through strange dynamics of a collective unconscious, or may I say even a collective conscious, is something that we need to keep in mind. Alim, Amrit?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank
Again,
you.
a
Thank you.
wonderful-
Let us welcome Dr. Kiran Kumar. He has come. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for the delay.
Okay, if you want, you can have a brief remark before you start on with the moderation.
Okay. First of all, I thank Dr. Shekhar for the wonderful presentation, sir. I really appreciate the talk, and the main points which you talk about suicide contagion. It is very impressive because it is like infectious disease, definitely. And you talked about media reporting, which is very important because the way media reports, especially farmer suicide, it is a very sad thing. And about Beck's hopelessness, it's wonderfully spoke, sir. And we love to see that suicide helpline which you are going to launch on 22nd July. So we definitely will be watching live. So as we know, and WHO says that almost 7 lakh suicides occur per year, which is, and most of the time, suicides are preventable, unless it's an impulsive suicide. But the rest of the suicides can be prevented. Like if we know the depressive symptoms, most of the time the cause of suicide is depression. So if we are able to identify the early warning signs of depression, definitely we can prevent suicides. So I thank for the organizers for giving me the opportunity for this wonderful webinar. I thank the team Odisha, IPS Odisha, for giving me the opportunity. Over to the moderator, sir.
Gaurav, sir, any comments from you?
Yes, sir. As usual, sir is excellent. And ring the bell bajao. It is a big thing actually. We are generally avoiding it as a society. Usko apna karne do, kya farak padta hai. But I think that one initiative can at least save a single life. I think a single family. Even though we can face the betrayal of aap apna kaam karo, I think that's a great message for all of us and society also.
Thank you so much, sir. Amrit, would you like to start?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a question, and I also it was there in my mind. It's in the chat box, so I'll always. So, what is your view on religion as a protective factor for suicide? We have read about a lot of things, but many times we read, I've read about this suicide pacts among all the religions actually. So I wanted to ask you about that. Spirituality, religion as a protective factor. We've heard. Is it really protective?
Amrit, I did notice that Indu Nair has asked this question. I'd like to take this opportunity to also remember Dr. Venkoba Rao from Madurai. Dr. Venkoba Rao has been such an inspiration to many of us who entered psychiatry in the late 70s and the early 80s. And in one of the chapters that he had written, he spoke about something known as suicide counters. Precisely what you're referring to, Amrit, as a protective factor, and what Indu is referring to as a protective factor. So what are some of the counters to, for an individual in a situation of predicament? कोई भी व्यक्ति किसी कठिन परिस्थिति में हो या विडंबना हो, तो what does he or she have within his resources, or what recourse do they have which prevents their thought processes or their cognitive processes not to escalate from I'm in a difficult situation to my difficult situation is intolerable, it is unsolvable, I do not wish to live, I wish to die, and I wish to kill myself. And you know, and then all the planning and the methodology and so on. That so religion, according to Venkoba Rao, was one such factor, as was stable social networks. You know, when I'm in a situation of predicament, who do I go to? Who has always been affirming of me? I know, for example, that Gaurang has always been affirming of me. तो कल को कोई चिंता हो तो मैं निसंकोच गौरंग से बात करूंगा, तो I know that he will affirm me and appreciate me, that rather than and this is what if you link it to Aaron Beck's principles of hopelessness and the whole cognitive triad of helplessness, hopelessness, and worthlessness, and all the cognitive distortions that he speaks about, if you want to follow that model of the other issue, more recently, in fact, the entire group from the Western Psychiatry Institute, from where, you know, Aaron Beck and Maria Kovacs and all these people who worked, are now speaking not so much about the cognitive part of depressive processing, but about emotional regulation. So in fact, Maria Kovacs has recently come up, particularly for younger people, something known as contextual emotional regulation therapy. So what are your safe spaces and your safe homes? So if you look at it from an ecological perspective, the ecological model of suicidology, Maurice Holbach's, he spoke about immediate, intermediate, and remote causes of suicidality. The immediate cause is a complete given up hopelessness. The intermediate cause is a relationship breakdown, a failure, a stress, diagnosis of terminal illness, mental illness. But according to Maurice Holbach's, a remote cause is always a society in transition. And where our systems of absolution, whether they are religious institutions or whether they are educational institutions or the family as a supportive structure, where there is a relative breakdown or a dilution of the stability of that structure, then the chances that you respond to a challenge or a predicament with negative cognitions is that much more than if you have connection and deep connections to structures which are protective, you know, such as, and this is the point that Indu makes, that that some studies in Kerala have shown that religion, and she refers, of course, to Islam, is protective against suicide. And Malappuram, as an example, has one of the lowest suicide rates in Kerala. But Kerala as a whole, or you know, Bangalore was once known as the suicide city, and now we have Sikkim, and then we had Kerala also in between. That Sri Lanka, if you look at world statistics, had among the highest rates of suicide. And friends, let us recognize what is happening in Sri Lanka now. They are in the worst economic disaster that their economy has collapsed. And if you look at it from a mental health perspective, with their very strong Buddhist leanings, or despite their very strong Buddhist leanings, and a significant Christian and Hindu community, that it still had one of pretty high rates of suicide as reported in world literature. Yeah, so these are some of the responses that we need to keep in mind. And I think, Amrit, this also relates to the question that Sanika has put after that, कि ultimately जब हम history taking करते हैं, we ask about self-harm, and we should, because there is this notion कि if it was not there in their head, and if we ask it, maybe we're suggesting that that's a wrong notion. You must absolutely, and there are ways of asking. And it's exactly the same as the phenomenological dimension that I've put, that are there difficulties that you're facing, and what do you think about these difficulties, and are they reaching a level that are becoming difficult for you to handle? That did you approach anyone? Did they help? Do you feel that have you ever felt there's no solution on site? So there's a whole range of factors that one needs to, and in some other session, I would be happy to share this, that in fact, Alim and Amrit, I have a whole presentation on a helpline model which looks at 4 important dimensions, and in each dimension it looks at about 10 factors. So I have something like about 40 to 60 parameters in a phone call itself. That would be, I think, amazing but maybe we can keep that for the 125th session of Thursday Musings, if not the 111th, which could be, like the cricket defines it as being on a Nelson. But coming back to the point that Sanika made, I think that to ask about suicide counters, and to also ask about kisi se aapne baat ki hai, and what did people suggest were ways to deal with conflict, because if you connect it to the whole issue that Nikita had raised about collective non-suicidal self-harm, which is the way that young people, the youth, commonly look at conflict resolution. And this is what is known as the life skills model in preventive promotive work, which WHO has propagated. Alim, Amrit?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, Dipali wants to ask, how do we deal with the adolescent couple who want to commit suicide because life is meaningless?
I think there are 4 parameters here, Alim: adolescent, couple, life, and meaning. If you just take it as a broad thing, then sometimes one feels a little challenged in responding to it. So first of all, our approach must be to understand adolescence, the adolescent brain, the adolescent mind. Then understand the dynamics of the couple, and examine the relationship dynamics, and then their ideology about life, including the kind of history taking that Sanika spoke about, कि family में supportive कौन है, supportive कौन नहीं है, उनकी objections क्या हैं, how old are they, are we talking about 14-year-old, or are we talking about 17 and a half, who in 6 months' time are going, by legal definition, going to be adults. And then to examine the whole thing of meaning, that unfortunately in psychiatric training, we have now gone so much into the CBT models of functioning. This is not to take away from its power or its effectiveness, particularly when we deal with large numbers. And of course, its modern avatars, which is the mindfulness-based and the whole positive psychology. But hamari purani dynamic psychotherapy and the whole existential models of therapy, which was so much important as part of the training in the 70s and the 80s, जहां हम जीवन के अर्थ के बारे में और मीनिंग के बारे में इतनी बात करते थे, to basically examine meaning from different perspectives, to say yes, if you take this, the meaning of life from the perspective only of the validation of your family members to your relationship, you might feel despondent. But that is one perspective. There are many other ways in which you put a value to yourself, to your partner, to this relationship, to your gifts, and to what your future life has in hold. The fact that at the age of 19 or 20, you may split from your family, never to have them reconcile. And the sad truth is, whatever objections parents raise about intercaste, interreligious marriage, not just for 17, 18-year-olds, even for 24 and 30-year-olds, and all the drama that is created, ultimately 2 years later, in a heterosexual context, everything becomes all right. And sometimes one wonders, why did you do all the drama if ultimately, you did reconcile? We are not even now talking about the predicament of people in a non-heterosexual context, of kids who are LGBTQI plus, and the kind of difficulties that they face in coming out, and family objections and so on. That I also see a very interesting question actually about something in Kolkata, about few suicides in young models who are friends with each other, and a whole lot of discussion on the suicidal contagion among many of us, and some of them went to discuss about it, and was it a good idea to talk about it, and many patients were not happy. The idea is not necessarily talk about, see, suicide is a behavioral end expression. There are many things that happen in a person's life before that, part of which has been depicted in a certain Manoj Bhandarkar film called Fashion. The Other Friends is in a very interesting book written by my dear friend Shefali Vasudev. It's called The Powder Room. Do try and get a copy of The Powder Room by Shefali Vasudev, or Madhur Bhandarkar ki film Fashion jo aapne dekhi hai. So the idea is not to locate the discussion at the level of the behavioral end expression, but located in the journey and the predicament and the complexities in the entire career of how one gets into the modeling business, and all the issues that come with it too. So that's what I would say. Yep.
Yeah, sir, a very important question from Dr. Saxena regarding, we are discussing this. It is good, but how can we use this knowledge? Will we able to save lives by teaching to mass, or take it as a part of moral science etiquette, or what should we do? Should we incorporate it in the teaching curriculum?
Bilkul, Alim. In fact, as I'm looking at certain other things that are coming. जैसे अर्नब ने ये कहा है कि बुरारी केस का जिक्र जो एक वेब सीरीज में भी किया गया था. Now the point is that, see, the media depicts people, relationships, challenges, conflict resolution in a certain way. Now, there was a Hollywood film called Ben-Hur, some 11 Oscar awards. So Judah Ben-Hur, played by Charlton Heston, is becoming very powerful. And Messala, who is jealous of him, played by Stephen Boyd, asks the question, how do you fight an idea? And he says, you fight an idea with another idea. So one has to use the media to subvert it itself. And this is where, Alim, as you rightly point out, इसी को हम life skills education कहते हैं. So we look at life, meaning, meaninglessness, suicidality as a behavioral end expression. और उससे पहले जो thought processes जो है, उससे पहले अनुभव, you remember what I said once? context, experience, inner voice, emotions, behavior. Suicidal behaviors is an end expression. Preceding that is an emotion. Before that is a inner processing, antardhvani. उससे पहले अनुभव है, उससे पहले एक संदर्भ है. So what we do in life skills education is we look at conflict resolution. We present different kinds of predicament, relationship predicament, failure, and so on, so that when a youth or a human being actually is in a real life situation, it doesn't come as a surprise, hi Toba, ab main kya karu? This is strange to me. This is unknown. I do not know how to respond. So to create a template of familiarity and of conflict resolution is what Life Skills program is all about. And this is exactly what we are doing as part of our SAMVAD initiative when we work in the education system. So if you actually look at our life skills modules, both for the 9 to 12-year-olds and the 13 to 18-year-olds, we look at various things. How do you deal with anger? This whole notion, remember, dynamically of the dynamic explanation of suicide as aggression turned inwards, as loss of a loved object, as denial of ambivalence, of ambivalence towards a loved object, and denial of ambivalence towards a loved object as the dynamic origins of. So how do you deal with these kind of relationship complexities that? तो ये कुछ प्रक्रियाएं हैं. तो हम लोग जब ये क्रिया, प्रक्रिया और प्रतिक्रिया की बात करते हैं, उस इंडिविजुअल की मानसिकता में भी और एक मेंटल हेल्थ प्रोफेशनल की मानसिकता में भी. इंडिविजुअल की मानसिकता में क्रियाएं जो है, जो वो करता है, और पीपल रिजेक्ट हिम, डिसअप्रूव एंड सो ऑन. फिर उसके मन में एक प्रक्रिया होती है, उसकी प्रतिक्रिया है, चल यार ये काट लेते हैं, दवाई ये खा लेते हैं. And as a mental health professional, हमारी क्रिया क्या है? That history taking, perspective taking, and the प्रक्रिया is हमें ये समझना कि between context, experience, inner voice, emotion, and behavior, how do we make an analysis on the basis of which we give our therapeutic responses, which empowers, reassures, and gives a different perspective to a person that this is not a good enough reason for me to even contemplate, ending my life. So that's the kind of stuff that I'd also like to acknowledge at this point of time. There's so many wonderful things that people are saying. My friend Roop, thank you very much for your appreciation, and also I think Nimisha perhaps, or Nimish, or Nimith, Kasturi as well. Thank you very much. So I think Dr. Saxena ki point bhi humne answer ki hai. And of course, I would like to acknowledge on this session the presence of my teacher, Dr. Mohan Isaac. Dr. Mohan Isaac has also been associated with the Medico-Pastoral Association since its inception. And his deep interest and work with the Department of Epidemiology, with Dr. Gururaj in NIMHANS, to really table suicide prevention as a major agenda in the national health policy and in our work, that is exceedingly important. So this is actually the 20th year. Sahai was established in 2020. This is the 20th year, and I think this would be just an apt time for many of these organizations to actually organize special sessions in the light of this incident in Sangli to look at this issue. I noticed that Dr. Mohan is here. I'm sure he would have things to share. Mohan?
Mohan sir.
Okay. Please.
Thank you very much, Shekhar. It was, as always, a great pleasure to listen to you. I thought I would keep quiet, but then you mentioned very kindly about Sahai, which you helped set up 20 years ago. That was not a very great idea at that time. It's one of Sneha was there. Lakshmi Vijay Kumar was doing something similar in Chennai. And when Bangalore, Shekhar referred to Bangalore being the suicide capital, not now. Now he mentioned it is Sikkim, but several years ago. At that time, when this helpline was set up, it was just an idea. Shekhar was very actively involved. He helped set up the training program of lay volunteers, did number of things. Shekhar is, of course, wanted by many organizations, many people. So after that, his involvement has been largely advisorial and not coming for every training session. So he mentioned about that, and I thought I must mention that in Medico-Pastoral Association, this year they are observing 20th year of Sahai. I must tell Shekhar that it is going on very well. Suicide has not disappeared. It is a problem. Helpline is used by a lot of people in Bangalore. There are now many more helplines. For many years after it was started in the 2000s, that was one of the very few helplines. Now there must be many. So that just shows the need of this. I just want to tell you one or two more things, Shekhar, since you mentioned about in response to Indu's question, that Malappuram may have the lowest suicide rates, Kerala having high rates, etc. I would think that the family suicides or the suicide pacts that you talked largely, which are also referred to as murder suicides, but a lot of them which I am familiar with from the newspaper from Kerala. These are young children, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. I mean, it's not suicide. The parents murder them for whatever reason. I mean, murder is a very, Shekhar used a much more sophisticated word, homicide, suicide, murder, suicide. Uh, uh, what I was going to say was, even in your report, most of the reports that you mentioned are 2022, 2019, 2000, Bombay, Nagpur, etc. But the story of the girls you mentioned was 1982. So I think that the suicide pacts and the family suicides and the murder suicides is, at least from the Indian perspective, is an invention from Kerala. It is generally said about many things. What Kerala does today, India does tomorrow. So I think this murder suicide, which used to initially in the 80s be reported largely from Kerala, now has become a national phenomenon. From Nagpur, Sangli, Bombay, everywhere. This is one point I wanted to mention. I mean, this is just of historical importance. And as it happened in February of 2022, there were at least 3 family suicides of the themes being many of the things that Shekhar mentioned. Second point, since he mentioned about Ben-Hur, I cannot control myself, my urge to talk about movies. I'm referring to a movie called, which many of you may not have watched, but it's called Thelma and Louise. It's a 1991 movie. Shekhar is shaking his head, so he has definitely seen. It's about 2 women. I mean, he mentioned about a lot of themes, about largely from the Indian perspective, poverty, loans, relationship breakdown, etc. But this is about, in the 70s, there was a lot of, the feminism was awakening in the United States, and there were a lot of critics. So this is a story of 2 women who were activists, feminists, who wanted to have fun and do a number of things and get involved in various things. And ultimately, they both drive speeding over a cliff and die. It's a kind of a suicide pact. They decide that we are not going to get caught by the police, but we will. And the cliff was in the Grand Canyon. They died there. And since the question came from Calcutta about TV, is it okay to discuss? Subsequent to this Thelma and Louise movie, there have been many such instances where, as recent as I think few years ago, I read in one of the newspapers, a couple did exactly the same. You drive fast and then allow the car to go down the cliff. So by method, it's a Western thing. So I just thought of, as he was talking about Ben-Hur, I was thinking of Thelma and Louise. That's all. Back to you, Shekhar. It was, as always, a great pleasure to listen to you. And an excellent talk, a food for thought for a lot of us for, many days. And the problem of suicide doesn't go away. If at all anything, it comes back, with greater issues surrounding it. And all of us have a great responsibility. Back to you, chairpersons.
One question that has come in my personal chat box now. One psychiatrist has asked that in the suicide pact and all, in the current suicide that occurred actually, there are a lot of people who, okay, the husband having financial pressures, he convincing the wife is okay. Somebody poisoning young children, maybe 4 years, 5 years, we talked about murder suicide is okay. But what about a 25-year-old, a 23-year-old daughter or a son, doing the same thing? What is the psychology behind such thing? But it's not so easy to convince a 23-year-old or a 24-year-old or 18-year-old to do what everybody is thinking. That's a very difficult thing. How what is the psychology behind this? And how can we, Alim was talking about how to prevent things like this.
Amrit, patriarchy is alive and kicking. You can be 50 years old, you're getting your 25-year-old daughter married, but to your 80-year-old father, you're still an idiot.
What?
So the point is that the influence in a very patriarchal family structure of the head of the family, even on so-called adult children, particularly in the background of the kind of family dynamics we have, where the relationship of parents with children is not constructed on the basis of a culture of conversations, but on instruction, expectation, control, and obedience. And this is the reason why parents would object even to an intelligent, educated, high-functioning, well-employed 28-year-old who wishes to marry someone of his choice, or who discloses that he's gay or she's lesbian. So there is a certain gendered, there is a heterosexist, homophobic, patriarchal approach to the whole relationship of youth to their parents that really determines that. You complicate that with economics, and you complicate that with social pressures, then the dynamics become that much more complex. And if you look at very many traditional families, that how many children really have a voice, and how democratic are our families. This comment that I made is indeed a trailer to a session that I would like to do for Thursday Musings on parenting. So I will hold on to some of the comments that I wish to make on that as a prelude to some of the thoughts and perspectives that I would like to share. But I do want to say, Tufan sir, Alim and Amrit, that this session and this incident really is a call for us as a fraternity to look at the phenomena of suicide and suicidology with a wider socio-political lens, and not merely as a clinical phenomena. I believe that we have a larger public mental health role to play, and this is what I have learned from the people who've been inspiration for me in public mental health. Mohan being one of the primary people from whom the whole inspiration to really talk about community psychiatry, and in my context, public child mental health, of which SAMVAD is the biggest example of a massive project which is running in 29 states, having trained more than 120,000 service providers in 4 verticals, in education, in mental health, in care and protection, and in policy and law. So, and this is what we did when we sent our first letters to the court to say that suicide is not a legal problem. It is how can you have a punishment against attempted suicide? I mean, abetment is another issue that, and we know that there was a certain background there of why it took a while to re-examine the law, and there are socio-political reasons why there was a resistance, particularly when people go on hunger strike and so on. The only way you can hospitalize them is if you apply that particular provision under the law. But I think that this session has been remarkable, and it's good that more than 100 people have stayed till the end of the session, because I think
we had 180, more than 180, 190.
Yeah. No, it's
Not the end.
Yeah,
Not
it's
the end by now.
Yeah, it's an indication that the public health imperative that we have to speak about and work on is something that this session has really helped us highlight in our minds. Over to you.
So, Asha, I have a
Sir,
point to this. Okay, you ask, then I have a point to raise.
yes, sir.
When
Sir.
it comes to me.
Yes, very small points. Sir, when this pact or this phenomena is going on, it is mostly an influencer and a gullible person or persons, or it is a sort of collective decision in your knowledge, in your experience?
There is always, Alim, a primary. This is what the literature says, and if you in one aspect of the pop, there is always a primary influencer that. But the phenomena of manufactured consent, that how sometimes matters get complicated, or may I even dare say perverted, in a way to say that ये मेरा व्यक्तिगत निर्णय नहीं था, मैंने सिर्फ बात छेड़ी थी, but everyone contributed that. How on earth does one take a collective decision that if you look at it from the perspective, if there was actually a hidden camera or a fly on the wall, that, and how was this collective decision taken? It is, was it taken like within 15 seconds? Is it a drama or a story that played out over 1 day or 2 days or 3 days? So, there you are. That, yeah.
How would the dynamics be before this incident or event happens? So the long term, how would be the picture of the family or the group before, suppose 1 year before, 5 years before? So what would be the dynamics there?
The dynamics are, always determined by how traditional patriarchal families are. And even as we go along, Alim, in this process, even if there is resistance or objection, how that gets weakened. So if you really look at the psychotic context of suicide pacts, the Jim Joneses and perhaps the Burari case and all that. So that's one aspect. But how sometimes in powerful families, when there is a powerful autocratic patriarch, किसी और की बात चलती ही नहीं है. Nobody has a voice that. So every resistance is quelled. And ultimately, the voice of the autocrat or the patriarch prevails. Any resistance is quelled, weakened. And then you capitulate, because it's far more problematic, to resist, because these social complications are too many. Unless you are a really strong rebel and you say, go to hell. I'm just getting out and I'll do whatever the hell I want. That, and some people do that as well. That, which is why these pacts are not daily occurrences, but they are not rare as well. And we need to take cognizance. If you look at the figures, 72 cases in 2020, and so they're not rare. And we need to be prepared. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Over to Tufan, sir.
I am Dr. Seshadri here asked answered a part of my inquisition that came to my mind when the case of Bhatia deaths in Delhi was quoted. 11 people died in that case also. And as I remember the old story, the senior Bhatia expired in 2007. And the person who became patriarch in that family, he used to get messages from the dead father. And he chronicled everything in his diary. And in all family decisions, he communicated to members that you have to do like this. And one of such decisions was to commit suicide, for whatsoever be the reason. Yes, his name was something like Lalit, who became the patriarch and led to the activity in 2018. And in that suicide, there was a lady who dissented to be into the pact, but he was compelled. Now we are in this condition, those who are adults, and there is a patriarch order to commit suicide, they will have their legible, intelligible dissent. And if it is forced upon them, it amounts to what Dr. Seshadri told, suicide, homicide. And those who are children, they don't have any right to consent. They just obey. And this is a very good sign of abatement of suicide by the so-called initiator. So this complex situation, but my point is that this complex situation is visible to the neighbors much before it occurs. And it was also visible to the Bhatia neighbors in 2018. And it becomes a part of social responsibility. And the right, law also should give a right for the neighbors to interfere. कोई आके बताएगा कि अपने घर के मामला है, तू कौन है? So this is the need, because it's not so sudden. Maybe the Bhatia got a message one night, but this set of temperament, its activities continues. And in most of the pacts, as it occurs to me, as I have read many, followed many of the news, it is a case of suicide come homicide, and at times homicide is more than suicide. 5 children, how can they commit suicide? They have only obeyed. And I have asked them tomorrow, I am the killer. So the social responsibility has to rise. And the suicide helplines should develop a way to be proactive in such cases if there is a call from a neighborhood. This is something has to evolve. Amrit is there, the bus of IPS for suicide. But we have to have a means to interfere if there is a call from neighborhood that this is foreseen. Thank you, sir. This is just, these thoughts came through my mind while I was listening to you. Your mention of 2018 accounted me before the news clippings in those days. So मैं सबको sum up करके मेरे जो कहना है कह दिया. But I think that is a prime concern also. The social responsibility has to be there. Otherwise, you will be having only post-mortem analysis. One can analyze the diary of Lalit. That is all we can have. But prevention is also important, not in singular suicides, but also in packed suicides.
Thank you.
So आप अमृता को रास्ता बताओ कि उसके ऊपर भी काम करें. He is spearing the suicide prevention helpline of Indian Psychiatric Society.
Thank you, sir. So there's one interesting question before we end. If in a suicide pact one survives, what happens to the individual? What about the survivor guilt? Will there be guilt of surviving? Will there be guilt about not being able to make the others survive? So how do we deal with such questions? And with this, I would like to thank Dr. Shekhar Seshadri for an interesting and a brilliant session. It was on the spur of the moment decided. We changed the topics. I was supposed to speak on something else. So I was not very well prepared, but then I convinced her that no, this is the need of the hour. Thank you to our brilliant chairpersons, Gaurang sir and Kiran sir. Thank you to everyone. And with that, I would like to end by asking the last question to Dr. Shekhar Seshadri sir. So please.
I have two very quick.
Amrit, he can also chairpersons for any closing remarks.
Sorry,
They've been waiting.
I forgot that.
I have two very quick responses. There is a colleague of ours who, from social work from NIMHANS, who's been working in Norway for many years, K.S. Lata, whose doctoral work in Norway was on young suicide. And K.S. Lata has a very important publication, Anmol, on people who have survived a suicide pact. So if you just go to the Google Scholar and put survivor of suicide pact and K.S. Lata, L-A-T-H-A, it's a very good paper to read. It gives you perspective. But since movies ki baat ho rahi thi and Mohan referred to Thelma and Louise, I want to refer to a movie, one of the first movies that Robert Redford, who runs the Sundance Festival, directed. It's a movie called Ordinary People with Donald Sutherland. His two sons, and the two sons are in a sailing thing, and one of them dies in a drowning accident. It's not a suicide pact, but it's about survivor guilt. So survivor guilt can occur when an event takes place and people die and someone survives that. So the brother has intense survivor guilt and he's in therapy, and the actor who played the psychiatrist actually won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for that year. And there's a very poignant scene in which this boy asks the psychiatrist, "Are you my friend?" And the psychiatrist says, "Of course I am." You know, there's therapeutic objectivity and neutrality. No, I'm not your friend. I'm your therapist. I'm your doctor. So the whole issue of a therapeutic alliance, to look at the legitimacy of guilt, I see that my friend Murli was also on the session. I don't know whether he's still there or not. Either it was in our MD exam, if I'm not mistaken, in our psychology exam, where we had a question on the psychology of guilt. And one could start with the Bible, or, one could start with several areas of whether, Hindu cultures are shame-based cultures and Judeo-Christian cultures are guilt-based cultures there. So guilt is a very powerful and a very distressing dynamic. So Anmol, yes, people who survive, because the dynamics involved are exceedingly complex. There's a whole dynamic that preceded the act, that preceded the pact, and that preceded the fact and reality behind the pact. And then the survival. This was the survival characterized by hospitalization and cognitive deficits, and when did the realization strike? And so there's a whole range of guilt-related issues that come to mind. That I am delighted to see Murli on this session. I'm also delighted to see that we are beginning to look like twins. Yeah,
Thank you so much, sir. Any closing remarks from the chair?
I think it was excellent session. I think now in the suicide history taking, we all need to ask about whether you have searched the net, you have been active on any suicidal pages or suicidal chat rooms. I think we need to go even further in this subject. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be here, and thanks the Panpati sir for the invitation. And as usual, Seshadri sir, I would love always to listen to you anytime. And it was wonderful team. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful presentation, the facts behind suicide pacts. And I thank all the office bearers of IPS Odisha State Branch for giving us the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So much good.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. ऐसे मिलते रहेंगे.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Good night.
Dr.
Everyone, good night.
I think Murli sir is here.
On. Hello, Dr. Murli. Hi.
Murli sir, please unmute.
Unmute.
Nice to see all of you. A great session. And again, reiterating condolences to Dr. Ufanpati. What Shekhar quoted is an article before our examination, an article by Professor Vengobarao on guilt. And they have put a question only on guilt. So at that time, we wrote basically what we felt from the historical evolution of guilt and all. Okay. But now it's something very significant, and Shekhar remembered that. It's great.
Yeah.
At this age also, your memory is very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Murli. It's lovely to see you, Murli.
Thank you so much, sir. Shekhar sir, we have too many leads to call you too many times again. So
नहीं तो दो तीन चीजें हैं. I guess the recording has stopped, right?
let me stop it, sir.
Recording बंद कर दो.